Thank you, Mr. Eric Shaw. Those were indeed assuring and insightful words. On behalf of our audience today, we would like to thank Mr. Eric Shaw for gracing our event with his presence. Ladies and gentlemen, now it is my privilege to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Peter Vint. He will be sharing on the topic Unlocking Potential, the Art and Science of Coaching, and the Relentless Pursuit of Better. With a PhD in biomechanics from Arizona State University, Dr. Peter Vint currently serves as the Chief of Sport for USA Volleyball. He is also an internationally recognized expert in high-performance sport. His expertise includes the evaluation, development, improvement of high-performance athlete, development systems, and the implementation of effective sports science, technology, and analytics. Dr. Vint has served as a trusted advisor, consultant, and educator with several leading sporting organizations. He is passionate about creating environments and experiences that allows the performers to understand, explore, and independently modify the unique technical, tactical, physical, and mental emotional attributes of their chosen activity. This talk explores the scientific basis of coaching and the art of effectively applying it to unlock the true potential that lies deep within us all. My colleague Hansen will be the moderator for this session. You may use the Q&A icon that you can see at the bottom of the screen for any questions. Dr. Vint, please. Dear invited guests, you are invited to stay behind and join us for the keynote session as well. Thank you for gracing today's event, and we hope you had a good time of interaction. Have a good day.
Hi, everyone. I didn't know if I was waiting for Hansen or if I should just go ahead. So tech support, if you were messaging me in chat, just let me know that I can go ahead or
Peter, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's quite all right. Well, hello, everybody from beautiful Colorado Springs, Colorado. It is an absolute pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually, in this strange time that we find ourselves living through. I find myself in a really remarkably fortunate position that I'm one of the few individuals, I suppose, who has truly found something that he has loved as his profession. And through the coaches and the athletes and the performance directors and all of the experiences and stories that we've shared, they have certainly helped shape my life and my profession, and have challenged me to be my very best every day. I've been fortunate to call a number of the world's leading coaches and athletes friends and colleagues, and those that I've worked with closely. And I'm very fortunate to consider you among my network of connections. Although we may never have the chance to meet directly, I consider it a huge privilege to be with you today. As you've heard, the title of my talk is Unlocking Potential. And I'll start by simply moving through a bit of my background. I am a trained biomechanist, so my sports science degree is in the field of biomechanics with postdoctoral work in motor control and skill acquisition. And over the time that I've worked in elite sport, I had the good fortune of being a Team USA delegate at 4 Olympic Games, supporting athletes in both summer and winter, and being part of some of the most exciting sport performances in the history of Olympic sport. After 10 years with the U.S. Olympic Committee, I had a remarkable opportunity to go work in Premier League football, and was the first American-born academy director ever hired in the Premier League, and landed at Goodison Park and Finch Farm in Liverpool, England, working with Everton Football Club, which now sits atop the Premier League table. It was a remarkable experience in that it let me take the experiences and the learnings that I had as someone working in high performance sport, really at the elite end of the spectrum, and now was challenged to support athletes from as young as 6 years old on their journey toward aspiring young professional footballers. So under the care of around 150 some odd academy players ranging in the age of 6 to 21, we were able to move forward in some pretty remarkable ways and put in place some holistic athlete development programs that are still intact today. Following my time at Everton, I left to become an independent contractor for a while, and was fortunate to be brought on to work as performance director for the Ineos 159 Challenge. This was a one-off event staged in Vienna, Austria last October, actually just over a year ago, October 12th, actually last year, where Eliud Kipchoge, the gentleman in the white singlet here, set the a human record, being the first person to run an official marathon distance race under a 2-hour barrier. And it was absolutely remarkable to be a part of this endeavor and to help set the stage for what would become one of the most decorated crowning achievements in human sport history. I've played, I suppose, an interesting role in my career in that I've never really been an expert in any of the sports that I've supported. I'm not an expert in track and field. I've thrown a javelin, but not very well. You wouldn't want to see me in a Speedo, although I've supported swimmers like Michael Phelps and Allison Schmidt. The work that we've done with bobsled skeleton in helping that team move from an outsider, which had never won a 4-man bobsled race in history, to winning gold in Vancouver in 2010, was not because I had great insight as a bobsled driver or coach or engineer, but rather I simply took a perspective of looking from the outside in and relying on my training, I suppose, and my curiosity to simply ask questions that maybe others that are closer to sport either failed to ask or were too close to recognize. So as it pertains to this particular talk, I want to admit, and in full disclosure, I'm not a full-time coach. I've never worked as a full-time coach in professional sport or in Olympic sport, but I've worked with a lot of coaches. And my training as a scientist and on the skill acquisition side, I've come at this from a perspective of wanting to share with you some of the insights and learnings from the scientific literature, but also some of the stories, both for the positive and maybe not so positive, that I've learned in my experiences working closely with coaches and athletes. So this talk is really about that dynamic, blending the science of performance, the science of learning, the science of education and coaching with the art of implementing it in a way that touches the lives of those that we support. And it's a remarkable endeavor and one that I have huge respect for. I think that I bring up this quote here from Marshall Gans from the Harvard Kennedy School: "Challenge the status quo, takes commitment, courage, and above all, a dedication to learning," as something that I think has inspired me over the years. I'm terribly dissatisfied with the status quo. I find it boring, I find it frustrating, and I'm always itching to try to improve in some way. And I'll quote over the course of this talk from scientific readings that I'll provide references to, as well as various books that have been inspirational to me and have helped shape my understanding of human performance, human relationships, and the things that bring us all together in sport. When we think about coaching, we ultimately, at least from my perspective, think of the profession that is charged with the remarkable opportunity and responsibility of helping people learn and helping them learn to do something better. Whether you're in the sport domain and you're helping your athletes learn and improve skill, whether you're in the performing arts and you're helping singers or dancers or musicians perform more technical or detailed or expressive repertoire, it doesn't matter. And this also applies, I think, to almost any domain of human endeavor that we can think of. But as we talk about this and kind of shaping the rest of the talk, we'll describe, I think, what often comes to mind when we think about what coaches do. We help our athletes or our performers become more skillful. And what does that mean? What are we talking about with skills or behaviors or traits or attributes? Well, I'm sure with the sports or the activities that you work in, if I asked you to name all of the skills that you are working to improve in your athletes or performers, or the types of things that you end up spending your time focused on because of their importance in the overall performance outcomes, you would certainly be able to come up with a list of things. And if I was asked you to then try to organize those, you may come up with something like this. This is very familiar in sport academies and professional sport, where performance teams will talk about the technical, the tactical, the physical, mental, cognitive, perceptual, emotional, and you can go on and on and on. Some clubs will include aspects of social dynamics, behavioral traits, attitudes, lifestyle choices, cultural aspects that are important to the club. We at USA Volleyball, in our work with young athletes, have chosen to describe these or organize these in the following way. We bring technical and tactical together. Technical is really about the discrete skills that are involved in the game of volleyball: serving, passing, setting, attacking, etc., blocking. Tactical are aspects related to the positioning, the formation, who moves where and when and for what reason to gain a competitive advantage. Mental aspects or perceptual aspects, being able to not only focus during times of pressure or anxiety and execute when the demands of the game really require it, but also the ability to pick up the motions of other players and to understand through a reading of the game where that setter on the opposing team may put the ball so that we can make quicker and more accurate decisions and hopefully be more successful and win points. Physical aspects, of course: jumping, diving, attacking, swinging, creating a stable platform so that you can pass the ball effectively. And then we really believe in a holistic approach to performance, particularly with our young people, and are emphasizing aspects of social skills, lifestyle skills. Those could pertain to things like time management as a high school student, sleep and recovery, of being able to adopt good nutrition habits and good interpersonal relationships, not only with their teammates, but with their friends outside of sport, and of course, their coaches and parents. And our last category is really more of a cultural one, and we just call it Team USA, but it is ultimately a catch-all area where these are the types of traits and behaviors that we on Team USA are trying to bring about, not only in our national team coaches and athletes, but in all of our athletes involved in our youth development pathways. So before we get into some of the details, I want to just, I suppose, provide a little bit of background from how I think about this because of some of the observations that I've had. And hopefully this will come together as we go, but as we talk about actually any of the skills, let me come back here for just a moment, because I think it's really important to recognize that all of these, whether they are specifically skills or we break out technical skills into discrete sport-specific activities, that all of these are teachable. Yes, some may have a genetic predisposition or some epigenetic limitation or preferred expression, but ultimately, these are skills and behaviors and traits that can, in fact, be changed through teaching, changed through coaching, and ultimately changed through practice and feedback. So while many times we think about the act of coaching as dealing with the X's and O's of deciding who's going to go where and what this play is going to look like, and then the physical exertions and activities and the techniques and the skills that are required to execute that, those certainly are all skills, but they are not the only skills. So aspects related to reading the game, aspects related to managing anxiety or stress or focus are all part of this as well. And so again, while there may be some predispositions and some athletes may be more naturally inclined to have an easier way about them or be more coachable than others, that in fact, every athlete in some way can learn and can improve upon every aspect here, as well as many others that you could come up with. So how does that process of becoming more skillful happen? Well, I'm going to break this down in an incredibly simplified way, because the way that human skill is actually acquired and then sustained is complicated. And in fact, we as scientists don't know all the answers of how this process works. But ultimately, as it pertains to coaching in sport or the performing arts, I'm going to lay this out in the following three categories. I'm going to describe an acquisition phase, which is really about the introduction to a new skill, or it's a reintroduction to a skill that needs to be performed in a different way, whether that's a different technique, whether that's a different standard. It is simply something that we have to do that we haven't really done before. So how does this work? As we're introduced to skills, instruction provides a way to guide a clear understanding of what it is you are expecting of the athlete or performer. As athletes nod their head and say, yeah, I got it, I know what to do, and you set them loose, what you'll see is that performances are not very good oftentimes. They're not very reliable. They are highly variable. But in fact, with practice, they improve rapidly. So there is a very steep change in the performance from the very first time somebody tries something new to maybe 5, 10, 15 tries later. And that variability, while it continues to exist, gets a little bit smaller each time. Because this is new and because athletes or performers are still trying to figure out, all right, well, what is this really about? What do you really want me to do? Does it really look like this? Am I doing it right? The mental resources that they have in addition to the ones required to execute that skill are often pretty taxed. They're depleted in a way that makes it difficult for them to attend to other matters. So a familiar example of this might be that you're asking a young football player, soccer player, to take on a new player, and then at the same time, while they're trying a new dribbling move, let's say, you're asking them to pay attention to what might be happening to a player across the field that you want them to pass to. Well, because if this is a new skill and it's being introduced, the focus of executing that one thing right there is so important, so encompassing from a cognitive standpoint, that the ability to lift their head up and look around and know where someone is now, let alone where they may be soon, is a really big ask. In fact, it's really difficult, but this is what happens in the acquisition phase. In the motor phase, regardless of exactly what kind of skill this is, here we've moved to a stage where the performer understands what it is you want them to do. They have some mental model of what it might look like. They've either seen through demonstration or they've figured it out to some extent, and they continue to improve. Performances are variable, but they are definitely more robust and less variable than they were in the acquisition phase. And they are particularly robust when they're able to work in constant or in non-varying environments. So high repetition sets where they simply have to repeat the same task over and over and over again. They can do so with a fairly high degree of proficiency. Not perfect, but certainly better. Now, because they're beginning to figure things out, the ability for them to attend to other matters cognitively, perceptually, etc., becomes a little bit more enabled. And as a result, you may come to expect that, in fact, they're further along than they otherwise are. And that's okay. The last stage, is an autonomous stage, where here there's been a lot of repetition, a lot of skillful work. Performances appear effortless, although in fact, from a cognitive and motor perspective, they're certainly not. But performance is particularly robust and it's consistently good, and to the point where now the same skill or skills that were taught initially can be modified and adapted and essentially brought to bear in unique ways given the different environmental constraints or requirements that the athlete or performer may be asked to complete. So again, the point here is that I would imagine, just as I did when I first learned about this, that you can imagine a dancer doing a certain skill, or a soccer player or a baseball player, and you're thinking of perhaps a discrete physical technical skill. And that's an easy way to think about this for sure. But what I want to reassure you is that all of the types of skill that we highlighted before, and all the others that in fact were not presented on that slide, follow the same kind of process. And anytime there are massive variations or big perturbations that look very different or feel very different or present some unique challenge to the performer's perceptual awareness, performances can run right back to a previous stage. They may be able to move quicker as they go through this, but whether you are teaching new skills, whether you're teaching more advanced skills, whether you're handing off an athlete from one coach to the next, and that coach teaches things in somewhat different ways, you can expect that athletes in some degree will go through the same process, perhaps in varying speeds, but they will certainly go through it. The thing to be aware of here is that if in fact you coach more than one athlete at a time, it's important to understand that each athlete, as a unique person, a unique human, will process information and will have varying degrees of coordination and skill and experiences that they bring to that environment. And so the rates that athletes will go through these stages may be dramatically different, and it's simply something to be aware of. Now, I, as a scientist and I suppose a data guy, like to illustrate points. And one of the important points that accompanies the previous one is a recognition that coaches and athletes and even parents really need to understand. And that is, performance is variable. No matter what it is, no matter what kind of skill we're talking about, the performance of that activity is variable simply because we're human. And our system adapts to the different conditions that we have, and we have all these joints and all these muscles and all these emotions and physiological responses. So from one attempt to the next, something is going to be slightly different. And so we can express a skill level, perhaps by looking at the average performance, or what we think of as we watch a young performer kick a ball for distance or for accuracy. We notice that, okay, well, they do pretty well, but there's quite a bit of variation on that. Or somebody that may be trying to hit a 7-iron in golf a certain distance. Well, they're not going to hit every single ball at exactly the same location. There's going to be variation around it. So there'll be an average level of performance, and then there'll be variation around it. And as we talked about the previous stage, the acquisition phase will be highly variable, and skill levels may be fairly low. There'll be some instances when performances can actually be quite good, but some of those just happen randomly. And likewise, there'll be some that are extraordinarily poor, and you'll think, oh my goodness, this kid doesn't have it figured out at all. But in fact, some of that is just a random chance as well. So the thing that I'd like to share with you is a quote from a good friend of mine, a psychologist named Jim Bowman, who used to talk with his athletes about this, about making their average better. So that each day, each time they went out to train or went out to practice, that their focus was on a particular aspect, whether it was an isolated skill or something that they have been working on with their coaches. Their task was to try to make that average better. And in that process, one of the things that happens as athletes move from this acquisition phase to the motor stage to the autonomous phase, and then they get progressively better and better at that, is that not only do performances improve as a function of practice and feedback, but variation reduces as well. And that is a really important point of performance. It's a really important part for athletes to demonstrate and ultimately build coach trust. But it's important for everyone to understand that even at very high levels of proficiency, there are still going to be great days and not so great days. And what we hope is by making the average better, if in fact we ever revert to our mean or revert to the average performance, that average is at least better than it was some time ago. The other thing that I'm mentioning here is that it is also important that we understand that performance in a constant environment where nothing has ever changed, where the direction of our movement is the same, the environment, the temperature, the sun, the humidity, all these things are the same. Well, that may be a constraint that we have because of the facilities that we typically train in, but it often is not going to be the environment that our athletes will compete in. And so this is one of the things that we're going to talk about throughout this presentation in terms of trying to find ways to promote a greater set of experiences or variations of experiences so that we can build a broader experiential base with our athletes. If I had to boil it all down and someone said, all right, well, how do I get better at something? How do I become more skillful? I would boil it down to two things, and maybe I would add a third. I would say that without a shadow of a doubt, practice and feedback are the two primary means by which a performer gets better at something. One without the other is ineffective, or it can be ineffective. And certainly the two, as they go hand in hand, is essential to reach progressively higher levels of skillfulness. The third, if I was asked to put one in, might be instruction, although I would characterize some of that within the feedback realm here, and we'll see why in just a moment. So let's say that we are embarking on either ourselves or with a student the task of becoming a better golfer, or at least becoming good enough that we can enjoy a day on the course. We go out to the driving range, we get a bucket of balls, and what do we do? What do we do? We know that there's certainly a bunch of balls here, and so immediately we should have a connotation that, well, doing stuff a lot of times would seem to be a really good idea and would in fact seem to be beneficial, and it is. And I suppose while it's a little bit obvious to say that repetitions matter, and the number of attempts that a student or a learner or a young athlete can have to do something will ultimately provide, yes, one, the opportunity to practice, but two, every opportunity they create provides an opportunity for feedback and therefore learning. So I'm going to kind of address this in terms of how effective repetitions are in maybe a somewhat different way. And I'm going to highlight two studies here. One was a scientific study done by Manchester United within their academy by a gentleman named Rick Fenoglio. And this was one of the first studies to actually document what I think many football clubs had already known, but had not taken the time to really understand what was happening. And that is what happens when you reduce the size of the court or field and you change the number of players in a more constrained space. So typically in adult football, there are 11 players versus 11 players, and the pitch is quite big. However, in training, that sometimes becomes impractical, and the level of skillful work of isolated small space encounters becomes problematic because everybody's simply spread out along this huge field. So what happens in these practices is that the space is reduced. And this particular study compared 8v8 versus 4v4 matches. 8v8 demonstrated fewer number of passes, fewer number of shooting attempts, fewer number of goals scored, and fewer numbers of 1v1 encounters and dribbling moves by significant numbers. So looking at these percentage values here, or the bar charts, which are certainly a bit dated, you see the magnitude of this effect. 5-fold increase in the number of goals scored, 2.8 times the number of dribbling moves encountered, all by simply changing the numbers and changing the size. Well, USA Hockey years ago recognized that they were getting beat by European teams who were simply more skillful with the puck. They skated better, they could maneuver with the puck and pass better, they dealt better with encounters in small space. And what USA Hockey officials recognized is that most of the youth development that was happening in the country was being done on full sheets of ice. And if you've been in an ice rink and you've seen really small kids trying to play ice hockey, you can see the futility of that kind of exercise. And from a purist perspective, there was pushback that, well, listen, but that's not the game. We play on full ice. We don't break the ice up into smaller segments because that's not what we're trying to do. That's not what how the game is played. But in fact, it is actually a way to increase the number of touches and the number of repetitions that athletes have the chance to complete. And so we see here when they took a regular sheet of ice and they broke it up into half and then broke that half into cross ice segments and then actually did analytics on under 8 hockey, what they noted is that the number of puck touches was 2 times higher in cross ice sessions than in full ice sessions, 2 times more passing attempts, 6 times more shot attempts, 5 times more passes received, et cetera, et cetera. So the question, I suppose, at the end of this is that, okay, so there are more touches. That sounds good, but in fact, does that relate to an increase in skill? And in fact, it does over time. I don't have specific data from these 2 studies that go on to show that, but in fact, the level of technical skill exhibited by youth development hockey players in USA's national team system has dramatically improved over time as a result of their cross-ice initiative. And the fact that almost every football club and academy in the world utilizes versions of small-sided games on almost a daily basis, I think speaks to the efficacy of that approach. So this is a bit of a complicated graph, and this is by a friend and colleague of mine named Mark Williams and Nicolo Hodges. They describe 2 really critical aspects of practice design, and that pertains to an element called blocked versus random practice. And you can think of blocked practice as the number of successive repetitions of a single skill that take place in a set. And random practice might be the same number of attempts, but the number of attempts of different skills is intermingled throughout the overall set. So as an example of this, if I was to go to a golf range, get my bucket of 20 balls, I might take in the block practice 10 shots with my driver, and then I switch to my 7-iron and I take 10 more shots. That would be a blocked practice. The random practice would take those same 20 balls, but would randomly choose which club I would choose to actually hit with. And so in this way, we can equilibrate the number of repetitions and simply look at the effect of whether the repetitions were done as a block or whether they were distributed randomly. And the other element of this pertains more to the environment or the conditions in which the practice is designed. On one hand, you have constant practice environments would be consistent, low variability. From one day to the next, everything's the same. We go to the same court, we go to the same net, we use the same rackets, the same balls, they're all inflated to the same levels. The temperature in the gym is 72 degrees Fahrenheit, the humidity is 82, there's no wind, we practice at 10 a.m. in the morning. That's constant. On the other hand, it's variable, where now you encounter all of the types of challenges and unique environmental features, including those within the human body themselves, that an athlete may experience or a performer may experience in competition or in the performance themselves. So the question is, so what? And the answer is these things actually matter quite a lot. And so I'll provide one example of the study, but there is a rich body of motor learning research that documents the effects of these two dimensions of practice design, as well as numerous others. But let me just describe for you the results of one particular study, because as many motor learning studies can be, some are difficult to extrapolate to the real world, particularly real world sport. This study in particular did a very good job with that and looked specifically at how can we design a blocked versus random experiment in a real world sport experience like baseball. So what they did is they looked at a collegiate baseball team, and they assigned players into one of three groups: a control group that really didn't do anything, a random training group, and a block training group. And all of these groups received 45 pitches a day after training for 6 weeks. And in that 45 pitches, the blocked group received 15 fastballs, followed by 15 curveballs, followed by 15 changeups. The random group received exactly the same 45 balls, but the number of those 15 fastballs, 15 curveballs, and 15 changeups was randomized and presented to them in an order that they couldn't predict. And the control group just received fastballs and was able to continue doing nothing pretty much. Now, typical motor learning studies, well-designed ones, have essentially a practice phase where there's the time where players are introduced to the conditions of the experiment. They give lots of practice, and in this particular case, that's indicated by these first couple of dots. And the important thing to see here is that, in fact, the blocked training group, the group that received 15 balls of the same type, same pitch, and then 15 of the next kind of pitch, and then 15 of the next kind of pitch after that, performed better as measured by the number of solid hits than did the random group. And this is a really robust finding. This is a simple experiment to show you this, but this finding has been repeated extensively for decades in the motor learning and skill acquisition research. However, the important part here is what happens when you get out of the laboratory and you go into a more realistic environment. Well, now the study changes, or the results change, in fact, quite dramatically. And what happens when a random group now gets 45 pitches and they're all random, they're all mixed up, or they're all blocked, it doesn't really matter, or the blocked group gets all random pitches or all blocked ones. What happened is the random group, the group that trained with random selection of balls in the training period, actually performed significantly better than the block training group did. And this effect, known in the transfer phase, is attributable to a deeper or more substantial level of learning. Now, the mechanism for this is really only speculated, but it's thought that because of the nature of the training environment itself, when the nature of a random training environment requires that players cannot just simply zone out and know what the next pitch is going to be, because it was just like the last one, and kind of get in some groove and tune out a little bit. Rather, they have to be attentive to all of the stimuli that comes in and try to figure out how can I understand what's coming at me next so that I can actually do better on this test. As it turns out, you see that, well, in fact, in practice, they don't do as well. But because of the active process that they've gone through in training, they're able to retain more, and evidenced as an example of learning, can sustain that performance in a more realistic real world environment. So this is a really challenging finding, but it's a really important one, because in order to take advantage of this type of scientific finding, we have to acknowledge what we're practicing for. If we are practicing to perform well in practice, then we should just adopt block training, because it just allows players to get in a routine, and once they lock in on that, even if they zone out a little bit, they still do pretty well because they know what's coming next. However, if our goal is to improve performance in competition or in real world scenarios, then without a shadow of a doubt, random training is superior for that outcome. Now, we have to realize that doing so means that we will, in fact, incur more challenging practices, more frustrating ones perhaps, as a result of this more challenging learning environment. But ultimately, it is more realistic, it promotes more active learning, and best of all, results in significantly better and more robust performance when it matters most. But that's a difficult pill to swallow sometimes, and not one necessarily, if you haven't done it, you would start in an Olympic year, but certainly one that coaches of young players should understand. But you don't need to trust me, and you don't need to simply think of that one example as all there is. You can take a look at any sport and look at what athletes actually do. These are shot charts that have been presented by a guy named Kirk Goldsberry on Twitter. And they show the shooting locations, the frequency of shots indicated by the size, and ultimately accuracy figures of shooting in these particular zones by two different NBA players, National Basketball Association professional players. And so what I want to highlight here is not who's the better shooter, but rather there is huge variation in the actual physical locations that players shoot from in real game-like situations. Interestingly, however, if you've ever watched an NBA warm-up or an NBA practice, or I would even say college or high school basketball in some ways, the amount of time that athletes spend taking blocked constant shots, literally from a spot the size of a laser, not moving at all, and wanting a pass perfectly delivered to their hands in a catch and release position, is simply a waste of time. The rationale behind this, in consulting with some of these teams, is that players like to get a rhythm. They like to feel comfortable and confident, and make no mistake, confidence is hugely important. But I would argue, and have argued, that this is a false confidence, because getting in that rhythm is a rhythm that will never actually occur over the course of a game. One, because they will never stand or take the shot from the same location on the court. They will never receive the ball in the same location while receiving a ball in exactly the same speed, trajectory, weight, etc., spin, and they may not take it from the same degree of defensive pressure. When you add onto this layers of physiological or mental stress, depending on what part of the game it is or whether they just came in after substituting out, you can see that there is a huge amount of variation that is intrinsic to gameplay, match play, but in fact is often neglected in practice. This is one of the worst designs of practice of all. This is the drill line, the dreaded blocked constant, one kid at a time drill line, where you've got a couple of kids checking their shorts or biting their nails because it's not their turn yet, so they're kind of tuned out. One kid gets to play with the ball, nobody else does. This isn't very fun, but it also isn't very learning centric. So this kid is probably being asked to go and dribble around a cone and maybe then kick it onto a coach. None of those conditions will be ones that they'll really encounter. And so while there may be a belief that, well, this is necessary to build some basic level of skill before they can get on to more advanced things, that's fair. But what I would suggest as coaches is that we linger far too long and far too often in conditions of blocked constant practice, rather than recognizing that when athletes have kind of moved to the motor stage and know what they're being asked to do, even if they can't do it particularly well, they know what they're being asked to do. We should move them toward variable practice or random practice as often as we can. And it would be an interesting thing to say too, that kids tend to actually enjoy that more game-like play far more than they enjoy standing in lines waiting for their turn. So what happens? What do we do actually in practices? This is one example of a body of work that I find really interesting. And if coaching is truly your vocation and something that you're spending lots of time doing, one of the things that I would recommend to you more than anything is to essentially have someone help you measure the microstructure of your practice. And what I mean by that is have someone actually come and videotape and record and tag the types of things that you do, how frequently and for how long, and what kinds of things you say and how long you say them for. Having that kind of analysis is really insightful and can provide you with the kind of feedback that can help you address whether your practices are actually being carried out as you've intended or hoped. This is an example of research of that type. And these are relatively simplified in that the two parameters here, training form and playing form, are really aggregates of, in the case of training form, are drills, are moments of instruction, are moments where kids really aren't moving. They are the things that are really only done in training, and you would never actually see those things happen during a game. Playing form, however, is described as game-like, whether that's full-sided or small-sided games, constraints that are introduced to challenge different aspects of skill and tactics and techniques, but what you see is that even among Premier League academies, that the ratio of training form to playing form is a bit upside down from where we might otherwise expect it. And this is true from the youngest ages at U9 through the age that is one step away from earning scholarships and being considered a young professional. So this is work by Paul Ford, Ian Yates, and again, Mark Williams, but has been part of the Premier League's challenge to Premier League academies to say, listen, make sure that you are actually coaching what you think you're coaching, because if the game teaches the game, or if we're trying to have more ball rolling time in opposed and challenging game-like conditions, what we're seeing is that actually isn't happening to the degree that you perhaps think it is. So this is a really good thing that you can take and actually do with yourself, with perhaps an assistant coach or a parent or someone else. I'm only going to make mention of this on this one particular slide in this way. I did mention that as we were describing skills, that of course there is, the technical, physical, etc. And I did describe, mental and cognitive. And one of the things that I think is really challenging for coaches is that there's a sense that this is really important, and it is really important to understand and to help support cognitive processing or aspects related to what we think are more of the psychological aspects of the game, that in many cases those are viewed as some of the most important of all. But yet the amount of time and the energy that's dedicated to helping players improve those particular skills is often very, very small. And so I want to introduce you, if you haven't seen this before, this is coaching psychological skills in youth football, but the application of this is broad and could be used across any sport or performance domain, excuse me. This was done with sports psychologists in cooperation with academy coaches, and essentially started with interviews from the psychologists to the coaches to ask, okay, so you're describing that these psychological traits or these mental things are really important, but what do you mean by that? What does that look like? When you say commitment, what does that mean to you? And so through this process of understanding what coaches were saying and what they meant, and then being able to describe the discrete attributes that would help characterize elements of, in this case, a category of commitment, then not only were coaches more able to very specifically focus in on practice and feedback of those particular traits with individuals, but they were also able to allow their performance analysts to help code them in their training and competition sessions. And that became really powerful because now it was possible to actually assess, well, how is this kid on these things related to concentration or control or communication? And so I just want to say that even though I won't spend much more time on this, that these things are at least estimatable and they are certainly improvable. You just have to take the time to ask yourself, what is it that I mean when I say concentration? What would that look like? And how can I give my players experiences to help them become more skillful there? I'm going to conclude this particular session of the talk with two big take-home points about practice design. The first is that, yes, repetitions matter. The more athletes have the chance to practice a skill, the more skillful they are likely to become. But the key about this is that repetition in a blocked, constant manner has been proven to be a far less effective method of practice design than introducing random trials and variable conditions into the practice environment. So there's a phrase that Dr. Richard Schmidt, who is, I think, one of the icons of motor learning research, said, and that is, you should strive for repetition without repetitiveness. And so this is getting at the notion that lots of attempts are good, and that those attempts should happen in a way that doesn't seem rote, constant, blocked, where there is no real active engagement on the part of the performer. And the second one, I suppose I'll introduce by way of analogy. And I'll ask you to consider this in the context of particularly the constant versus variable environments that you are practicing in. So I'd like you to think about a box as an analogy for the volume of experiences that you are providing your athletes or performers access to as a function of how you've gone about your practices. If in fact you practice in constant conditions, that I always train on this court. I always look that way. There's never any wind. It's always 72 degrees. I always train on this surface. Then the experiential box that your athlete will have at the end of that will be relatively small. The volume of experiences will be small. Contrast that with introducing quite purposefully lots of different variation, whether that's, all right, today we're going to train futsal and we're going to be on an indoor hard surface, and tomorrow we're going to be on AstroTurf, and the day after that we'll be on long grass, and then the day after that it's going to be wet grass, and it's going to be rainy and windy, then it's going to be sunny and hot. And so introducing, or at least being willing to have practice in these variable conditions, actually builds a bigger experiential box. Now, the importance of this is that when you're not there to perform with them or instruct them on how to get through these different things that they'll inevitably encounter, the bigger the box, the more able those athletes are to interpolate or find solutions within that space. If you've only given them a small volume, their ability to extrapolate or interpolate within that is going to be relatively small and limited. If you've given them lots of experiences, they'll have lots of things to rely on and lots of points that their motor and perceptual systems have in some way been exposed to that now can actually lead them to solve for something that they're experiencing only for the first time. I hope that makes sense. With Jean Gauthier in the audience, this is always a tricky subject, but I'm going to now kind of address fairly quickly one of the other issues about practice that comes up, and that is, how much should I practice? How much should I practice to get good at something? Well, I'm throwing this number out here not because I'm a massive believer in Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule, but rather as an indication that to become really, really good at something, masterful, an expert at your craft, it takes a lot of time. Now, it's foolish to say that 10,000 hours is an absolute rule. If you practiced 9,999 hours, you might not be considered an expert, but by the time you did one more hour, you were magically world class. In fact, the world doesn't work that way. What I use this for is simply a placeholder to indicate that to become really exceptionally good at something, truly a master, it takes a long time and it takes an awful lot of effort. I've contrasted here a few readings, Gladwell's Outliers, Peak, which is actually my favorite Anders Ericsson book. He is the author of research I'll show next, and then David Epstein, who wrote The Sports Gene, which offers, I think, a very thoughtful counter to some of the 10,000 hours notion that had propagated through some of the popular literature. So here's Anders Ericsson's work, and I'm just going to fly through this. Essentially, his initial work, and the one that gained a lot of notoriety, really looked at accumulated practice histories of musicians. And through self-reporting, the amount of time that they had spent practicing on their own, they studied professionals, experts of various classifications, and amateurs, and ultimately related their skillfulness to the number of accumulated hours that they had acquired by a particular age. I've here indicated that, for 20-year-olds, the best of the best had accumulated a bit more than 10,000 hours of self-reported dedicated practice time. Those at 16, we are still seeing differentiation between these levels based on the same type of thing. And in sport, several researchers have attempted to document something similar. This is by Helson, Starks, and Hodges, showing that for footballers, that in fact the amount of dedicated practice time was differentiating between athletes that have achieved an international level of performance standard versus national versus more regional or provincial. So great. As it turns out, this was the basis for a significant change in Premier League academies that came out in 2011, called the Elite Player Performance Plan. And this is a mouthful, but it was abbreviated as the EPPP, and it's available as a document online. It's actually a pretty interesting read. But one of the things that they did is they said, well, wait a minute, we follow the research of Ericsson, and we've read Outliers, and we believe that we should, in fact, practice more. We should, as Premier League clubs that aspire to put more homegrown players into the professional game, we need to change the way we do things with our kids. So they looked at what other high-performing organizations were doing. They looked at the Yeadawin Menuhin Music School, I'm sure I butchered that name, the Royal Ballet School, British Cycling, etc., English Cricket Board, and noted that all of these were, at 10,000 hours or 8,000 for the case of tennis and swimming. And then they actually looked at what they were doing at the time, which was just under 4,000 hours of football practice. And they contrasted themselves with other clubs in competitive countries. And we're also noting the differences. So the EPPP was ultimately based on a desire to improve the conditions by which young footballers could develop. And one of the critical elements of this was increasing the number of on-field coach-led practice hours. And you see kind of the breakdown here. Category 1 were kind of the Premier League clubs. Category 2, broadly speaking, would be championship level clubs, and 3 and 4 would be lower level, second, third, and fourth tier clubs in the UK. Now, what does that really look like for young players? And if I contrast that, for example, with an American model, what we saw is that the Premier League Category 1 models, which have 4 hours rising to 8 hours of contact from U5 through U11, 12 hours a week to 16 hours a week from 12 to 16, and 16 hours a week from 17 to 21, accumulates about 8,500 hours from the time they're 5 through the time they're 18. I think I rounded down a little bit. By contrast, the US Soccer Federation, while it was trying to emulate some of the things that European academies were doing, implemented the following rules. Said that for U14 through U19 age groups, clubs were expected to hold 4 training sessions per week. And from U12 to 13, that was a minimum of 3. So if you took that at face value, that starting at the age of 5, the accumulated hours would be about 3,400. Almost clearly a significant difference between the two, and that's actually reflected in junior play in some of the Youth World Cup competitions. Americans are dramatically far behind in this sport. So accumulated practice has a lot. I'm not going to spend really any time on this other than to simply share it with you, because some of you may find it interesting. These are the actual breakdowns of how training times, training blocks are broken down in Premier League academies. Foundation phase are ages U9 through U11. Youth development are U12 through U16, and professional phase are U17 to U19. And it's simply a breakdown of where things happen. So football based happens to a huge extent, 85, almost 86% in the youngest ages, and tapers off to a little under 60% as they become closer to the professional game, primarily because they need the strength and stamina and the physical resilience to be able to compete against men at that level. But I'll leave this here for now and want you to make sure you have this deck that you can just see, for example. However, the one thing that the whole Premier League interpretation of the 10,000 hours rule didn't really well account for was observed again by Paul Ford. And this is an understanding of what happens away from coach-led on-field training time. And interestingly, what the results seem to indicate, and some of this is echoed by Ericsson's work himself, is that the amount of time kids or novices spend practicing away from formal instruction doing it themselves actually becomes differentiating in terms of, in this particular study, those young players who went on to earn a professional contract, contrasted to those who stayed as a recreational level or those that were released and did not earn a professional contract at the age of 17. So this is essentially the equivalent to, pickup ball or playing in the streets. My son, Will, loved football, loved soccer as a kid, and dedicated tons of time for it. And at the time, I was reading a lot of this literature, and I thought it would be fun, because I guess I'm that kind of guy, to try to estimate myself using Erickson's method. What did Will's profile look like? This was a kid who loved playing the game, but he also did all kinds of other sports as well, but always came back to soccer. And so I estimated the amount of coach-led on-field training time he had, and the amount of time that he spent in the cul-de-sac playing soccer with friends, or playing basketball with his neighbors, or just kicking around a ball, juggling on himself. In this particular photo, he's, for the first time, done 400 consecutive juggles in a row. The fun thing about watching this is that, first of all, he was the one that wanted to go to the gym to do this. But secondly, the number of times that he got close to 400 and then fell away from it, didn't quite get it, and would start over, was just an indication of his internal drive to become better at something that he thought was fun and wanted to be better at. So the interesting thing in Will's profile, it echoes a lot of what we saw in Ford's work, in that by the time he was 14, he had accumulated perhaps 6,000 hours of time that was related to soccer or other activities, but a full 2/3 of that was actually away from the coaching environment. And I bring this up only to share with you that coaches need to be cognizant that learning does not exclusively happen with you or with us. Learning and skill development and fun and gameplay and creativity and mastery often happens away from us. And often in the Premier League, it became so regimented and so heavily mandated in terms of the number of contact hours that it almost became prohibitive in terms of allowing kids the flexibility, the freedom, and the energy to actually do anything in their spare time, limited that they have. So these might be just examples of what deliberate play looks like. Kids playing on their own in the streets with a ball. You don't need anything fancy. It's just about fun and mastery. And in today's era, Jean Coté may know more about this, or some of the other presenters may, but I find it fascinating as I watch young academy players play games like FIFA. The level of understanding they have of tactics and space and movement, and how they can create challenging situations, even in a video game. So does this count? I don't know. But the proliferation of more realistic video gaming and live video from around the world has made accessible opportunities for kids to watch and see and learn, and then go out on their own and try new things, which end up being pretty important. I'm going to talk briefly on feedback. So a lot of what we said so far was about practice design. And now we kind of get to the other side of this, which is feedback. And this is clearly important. Feedback in and of itself, I would describe as information about a performance or an outcome, or the factors that have contributed to it. And it's important for us to recognize that there are all kinds of feedback. One of the most powerful kinds of feedback is intrinsic feedback, or it's the formal name that motor learning research gives it. What you can think of is feedback that the athletes have access to themselves. So these are just a couple of photos of European footballers who clearly have done something that they don't like. They know the outcome of a missed penalty kick, or a missed save, or something that they know that they should have been capable of doing. They don't need additional feedback. they understand that the outcome wasn't what it was intended to be. That's intrinsic feedback, can be very powerful. The other kind of feedback is described as extrinsic, or sometimes augmented, or extra feedback. So this is feedback that I suppose I would provide. First of all, it's the kind that coaches like to give a lot of. Oftentimes, interestingly, coaches like to give feedback about, or at least they say words about the feedback of activities that players already know about. Hey, you missed that shot, or keep it in next time, or you hit it into the net again. But intrinsic feedback is often the extrinsic feedback, the kind that coaches or some external source provide, is perhaps best described as information that the performer does not have access to themselves, or is not able to properly interpret themselves. So it may be that it's a body position, it may be it's a space and time and location issue. It could be that an athlete thinks that they have their body in a certain position, but in fact they don't. And this is where a coach can step in and either provide specific instruction, ask the athlete to emulate that, provide some tactile feedback here in the basketball shooting coach, or simply provide guidance that would otherwise be difficult for the athlete to gather or interpret accurately themselves. So it turns out that that's really powerful. And while I'd love to actually share some of the scientific evidence for this, I actually think that one of the most powerful ways to describe good feedback is by thinking of our GPS or our nav devices, because they've actually implemented a number of really powerful features that are consistent with the science of delivering great feedback. So let's think about what these devices do. We say that we're in location A and we want to get to location B. So it provides us with a plan, a map that would be in the form of potentially instruction that we give an athlete. We want you to do this in this way. And then based on how well we stay on our route, we get feedback. And we get feedback of whether we're staying on the route, or we get feedback of whether we've diverted from the route, or if something about the route has changed and we need to find a different route. And it's actually quite analogous to really good feedback design in human information processing. Because I want you to think about what we really do. If we go to a new city, when I first moved to Liverpool, I didn't know where anything was. And I was driving in a car with the steering wheel on the other side, on a different side of the road, and knew no streets. And I relied on the satellite navigation exclusively. So I needed feedback all the time, and I needed it to talk to me on a turn-by-turn basis to tell me where I was and where I was going and what I needed to do when. I was a novice. But eventually what happens is that we become familiar. And now I don't want to hear turn-by-turn instructions. Just show me the overlay and I can figure it out, because I've kind of been down this road before. I just need a reminder of where to turn, or I'm going to someplace new, but I at least know the area. So we essentially fade out, decrease the frequency with which we want and will use feedback. And that's really important. That happens exactly the same with athletes. And as we become really good and maybe don't need the nav at all, in fact, what we can do is we can adopt just clearly a summary of our performance. All right, well, how was my fuel efficiency during that ride? What was my average speed? How long did it take me this time, etc. The other thing that happens is that bandwidth feedback is introduced in this, in that only when you steer off course and clearly are no longer following the path, following the directions, does the GPS device intervene and says something like recalculating or rerouting, and it lets you know that you've gone askew. But it only does that when you have deviated outside of the intended path. That's also really important in human feedback, in that if we simply want to be more effective at giving feedback, we can reduce the frequency of it, and we can only give feedback when performances fall outside of a certain band of acceptableness. and that's defined as bandwidth feedback. It's actually quite good. Over time, what we do is we put this away. We don't need it. Maybe we keep it up to be able to know where police are or how traffic is, but ultimately our usefulness of this technology subsides once we become familiar and skillful with the routes that we're taking. The important thing is that we are able to kind of wean ourselves off of this feedback. I've done it by reducing the voice commands on turn by turn instruction. I've reduced it, based on the amount of time or notifications that I get about my route. And ultimately, I can get to the point where I don't need it at all. And that's what we should be trying to do with our athletes. We don't want them to be dependent on us to provide guidance of their performances. The more dependent they are on us, the less robust their performances will be when they are not with us. And that is usually almost all the time in competition. The other part of this talk is really about some of the more social and emotional and less scientific aspects from a quantitative standpoint of coaching. And as we heard in the opening speech, the level with which athletes can touch lives and can console and to connect with another human being is absolutely profound. And so I want to recognize that and tell you how deeply I value that and how important that is. I'll start this segment by sharing an example of Benjamin Bloom's work in this book, Developing Talent in Young People, which essentially looked at the roles that performers or players or athletes play along with coaches and parents in a progression through their career from novices in a new skill that they fell in love with, ultimately to being peak performers in their field, whether that was in sport or in medicine or mathematics, performing arts, etc. And so one of the things that's important here is to look at not only what a player's journey may look like or an athlete's journey may look like, but for our presentation here, what the changes or the types of people that end up having the most positive influence on the trajectory of terrific performers in the end might actually look like. So coaches that are introduced to the beginning stages of, it may be a young person's introduction to piano or a young athlete's introduction to soccer or baseball for the first time. The nature of the coach is someone who is nurturing and kind and helps that young person feel great about the activity and falls in love with it deeply. Ultimately, by the time they move through and now are developing and need to develop more skills, those types of skills and characteristics change in the perception of the performer and those around them. And again, even so further into the elite areas of the spectrum. I'll talk about a few other aspects here of just things that are kind of on the more artistic side of coaching, but are ultimately grounded in aspects of psychology and the science of how we process information. And this is an awful lot of information to present on a slide, but it's a really good slide to look at in your own time. These are cognitive biases. And one of my favorite books on the topic is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. But this is really all about things that end up creating misinterpretations of reality because we are human. And I'll say that in the context of sport, many of these are possible, but one of the most powerful of all is the availability heuristic, which ultimately could be described as what have you done for me lately, or all you see is, or essentially all I get is what I saw last. So if a performer comes off a terrific game, you may think that they're terrific. If a performer comes off a terrible game, despite what they did a week ago or a month ago or in their career, they are now washed up. That's the availability heuristic. And one of the most profound ways that this is kind kind of propagating through sport is through something called the relative age effect. These are examples of athletes who are of the same chronological age, but are actually wildly different in terms of their biological maturation. This is actually Ross Barkley, who now plays for Chelsea. This is him in a schoolboy league near Liverpool. And Ross, as a 13-year-old, was already almost a full-grown man in terms of his physical body, here competing with somebody in an age match competition. I bring this up as an example of a bias because ultimately, if we're watching an under 13 match, we are likely to be drawn to the player that is creating impact in that game. And in the case of Ross Barkley, who is also very skillful, but nevertheless physically dominant. So we get our attention drawn toward that and think that there is in fact something really special there. This bias is rampant in all of youth sport, with very few exceptions that I've ever encountered. These are data actually from the Premier League showing that the rate of signed youth players, whether it's the foundation phase from 9 to 11, youth development from 12 to 16, or the professional development from 17 to 19, that those that are born in Q1, based on a selection criteria year or time of year, represent almost 50% of all signed players. The next highest is 28% in Q2, the next 3 months, and then it gets progressively lower over the next 2. So this is fundamentally a cognitive bias that is that affects participation and opportunity often for the groups of athletes that find themselves unluckily born in later quarters. Interesting, however, by the time athletes end up in professional leagues, these groups are represented equally to these groups, indicating that in fact, disproportionately, it is the ones that maybe struggle to get through that end up being as or more successful in the end. I want to talk briefly about language. This is a really interesting study from the Center, the Study of Intelligence, that worked in American special operations and government intelligence. And one of the things that they noted is that when they would want to interview suspects or spies or people that were of interest, the reports that they would get from field operatives would contain words that were ultimately important to understand, but were ambiguous in terms of what their real meaning was. And so they asked over a course of studies, what probability of something happening would you assign to the phrase almost certain? What probability would you assign to the word likely, etc.? And what you see is that the actual data points around this, yes, they go in order, so that highly unlikely is much lower probability than highly likely. But the important thing here is that the variation, and therefore the differences of opinion about what these things actually meant, was actually quite high. And in a field like this, that was actually quite dangerous. Now, in the world of sport, perhaps it's not as critical, but I would argue that it presents a really important challenge for us as coaches to understand that ambiguous language creates ambiguous understanding in our athletes or our performers. When we say things, we can't be sure that they understand them, particularly as we've intended, particularly when we use language that is ambiguous like this. Here's the other thing that we do. This is chicken salad. The importance of this will be important, come out in a minute. Here are actual phrases from Premier League Academy coaches taken during meetings that were deciding the fate of young athletes, whether they would be signed on to the next age group, whether they would be promoted according to their time. And of course, ultimately, the last one here was, I can't make chicken salad out of chicken expletive. But these phrases are colloquialisms. They're things that we say. They're things that coaches talk about, the things that we say around the water cooler. He's got something. Don't know what it is, but he's got something. He's got a chance. He can't express himself. One of my least favorite is he's miles off. And the fact is, these phrases are fine when you're out at the bar talking with the coaches, or when you're around the water cooler or the canteen eating lunch. But these are not phrases that can be used in high performance environments. They are too ambiguous. They don't mean things, and they let everyone off the hook. In fact, what they really do is they promote a kind of labeling. So if we were to go back through these kinds of phrases and we would begin to say these kinds of things, what happens is that we begin to cognitively organize who's what kind of player. So we've got this kid who is miles off. I don't know what that means really, but he's miles off and he goes in this bucket. Now, the problem with this kind of labeling is that it's actually several-fold. One is that immediately it becomes as though this is an intrinsic, immutable trait. This kid today is miles off, or he's been miles off all year. Well, if I have labeled him in that way, now I have used a fixed mindset to say that, well, that's not changeable. I can't do anything about that. And the consequence of that is that not only does the kid feel terrible about it and wonder what they're doing with all their time, but the more important point is that it absolves the coach from, yes, the responsibility, but secondly, the opportunity to actually change the trajectory of this young athlete's path. I've seen this so often, that this labeling tendency, putting a kid in a box and then leaving them there because you already put the label on it, is something that we simply, as coaches, need to do better at. We're getting toward the end here. I appreciate your time. I am very moved by the performing arts, and I take a lot of information from diverse places. And one of the things that I read a lot about is people who teach and instruct in the performing arts. Musicians, coaches of musicians, dancers, etc., actors. And this quote is from the Juilliard School in New York, which is one of the most famous performing arts schools in the world. And they have in their admission document this statement: the success in any meaningful endeavor is marked by a history of high expectations that provide the challenge and inspiration necessary to press the individual to his or her highest level of performance. And from the education side, we see things like this: that effective teachers not only express and clarify expectations for student achievement, but also stress student responsibility and accountability. So these two blocks of text are really instrumental in asking yourself whether you are setting standards that are clear, that are helping athletes to understand unambiguously what is being asked of them, and then ultimately finding ways to encourage and create chances for those athletes or performers to be responsible and accountable for improving upon those expectations and ultimately meeting them, if not exceeding them. These are some of the words that are used by elite Premier League academy coaches to describe the traits that they feel are most instrumental in a player's ultimate ability to be successful and earn a career in the game. Notice that none of these have to do with technical or tactical skill. These are all psychological, mental, character-based, and they all relate around effort and drive and, yes, humility. And these words like self-belief, self-awareness, and self-regulation are hugely important. And what I want everybody to understand is that while, yes, and in fact, the literature will verify that these self-determination traits are very common in athletes that end up rising to the highest levels of their sport, that in fact, we as coaches have a massive opportunity to protect those things and nurture them so that they can actually manifest when they're needed most. These are often things that are really easily destroyed. This is just a very quick example. I'm not going to show the video, but you can find it on YouTube of an NBA team, which is coached by a guy named Steve Kerr, former Chicago Bulls player, head coach, one of the best coaches, I think, in professional sports today. And what he has done is he has recognized the importance of essentially giving players the autonomy to manifest their own performances, to critique, to provide feedback, to adapt and change. And what he did in the game against the Phoenix Suns earlier this year is he stepped away, gave the clipboard to one of his players who was injured, had him run the timeout. And actually, it was all about and completely driven by the players in the course of a professional league game. That is trust on the part of the head coach and the coaching staff, but it is also empowerment of those that actually play the game. And I think that was really, really well received. The last element of this talk is a bit of the other side of coaching. And this will be the last segment before I close up. And while I want to come back to the bell curve of performance to say that, okay, here we are, we've got an average level of performance, we've got variation around it, and we want to make the average better and reduce variability, get that. But there's the other side of this we have to be cognizant of, and that is what happens when performance falls off the curve entirely. And what do I mean by that? Well, as coaches, we introduce things like cuts or deselecting athletes, or we don't promote them. We essentially tell them that they're not good enough and they should get on with some other activity or the rest of their life. Or we create environments or physiologically don't prepare athletes well enough and they become injured, or they don't recover adequately and they're more susceptible to illness, or they're just so mired in this one thing that they've done for so long that they burn out. Those are things that we have to be cognizant of. This is the patella of a young man who was an 11-year-old soccer player and had the bottom of his patella torn off because of overuse, over repetition and under recovery. And to back this up, the data from the Premier League themselves indicating that across 25 clubs, documenting 4,500 injuries in a year from the ages of 9 through 21, and documenting over 650,000 training minutes, 43,000 of training days lost as a result of injury. This is really important that we recognize this aspect of the environments that we create, and we have to be observant of those. The last piece is even more detrimental, and often this happens when we find ourselves working with highly driven athletes and those that may be on a trajectory to earn opportunities to play professionally or may become Olympians. And what happens when that trajectory is either suddenly cut short or they step away? The body of work related to athlete identity is scary and it's sad. And it's something that we have to be aware of as people who care about and support those athletes that are under our wing. These are just taken from a simple Google search of athlete depression. And you see that there are some incredibly high profile athletes that have come from the highest levels of professional sport or Olympic sport, Michael Phelps, and now he's become a spokesman for mental health in the States. But this also pertains to young players who are in incredibly competitive youth sport environments that essentially commit almost the whole of their lives to a single endeavor, and then ultimately most of them are deselected or cut from advancement at some point in time. And these are things I won't go into. I simply bring this up as a note of caution for all of us that there is a really dark side to highly driven athletes who are almost maniacal in their motivation and drive to be singularly focused. We have to take great care to understand the other side of that. This actually popped up on Twitter today, and I thought it was a completely appropriate way to finish this talk. This is the experience that I've seen over and over and over again from some of the best coaches that I've encountered. And it makes me really proud to have the chance to share some of these things with you because I know the impact that you have. And the very last slide that I'll leave you with, ironically, a shot of John Wooden here, but a quote from Atul Gawande in his book, Better. Better is possible. It doesn't take a genius. It doesn't take diligence. It does take diligence. It takes clarity. It takes ingenuity, and it takes a willingness to try. I know I've been long tonight on my time, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this with you, and I appreciate so much the chance to be here with you tonight.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vint, for the very insightful presentation. Coaches, I do notice that there are some questions, and Dr. Vint, these questions are mainly related to how coaches are reluctant to train ugly, and they mainly view practice, like a rehearsal, rather than looking at how these practice effects can surface during performance. So we do not have the time to answer these questions, but I will send these questions to you, and we can we can surface these answers to the coaches on another platform, because we're actually short of time, and we need to run into another session right now.
Of course.
Yeah. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Vint, and I'm going to hand the session over to Mirianti.
Thank you so much.
Gentlemen, please do not forget to give your feedback on the Mentimeter. You may scan the QR code or use the code 3057894. We will give you a bit of time to give your feedback. Before we go for the break, here is a reminder that the next session is on charting the future, coaches as key players by the different NSAs and Coach SG at 11:15 a.m. In the meantime, you may want to immerse yourself in the unique virtual conference experience by exploring our different exhibition booths and available networking sessions. There will be 4 rooms that you can network, and these 4 rooms are summarized by the conference themes of pedagogy, leadership, sports science, and being future ready in coaching. If you're interested in any of these topics, you may enter and have a conversation with like-minded individuals. Thereafter, breakout sessions as well as the leadership engagement session will begin promptly at 2:30 p.m. later. Thank you.